So you should have just seen a really interesting, in my opinion, video on catching Burmese pythons in Florida. And I wanted to add this in as an example because it's a really dramatic example of an invasive species that's in our country. Um, and there is probably some suitable habitat in southern Louisiana for them. Um, and so there is the potential for spread of this to other places. It probably can't get too far north because it's going to be limited by our winters. So this is one of the largest snakes in the world, and it's one of the heaviest snakes too. So the heaviest snake in the world is the reticulated python. I believe it's pretty widely accepted that the Burmese python is second to that, and then anacondas are also extremely large. They tend not to be quite as heavy, but they're the longest snake in the world. But we have these Burmese pythons, which are extremely huge snakes that have been introduced in Florida. They're big enough that they can eat adult alligators, they can eat deer, they can eat lots of things pretty much that live in the United States. They were introduced to Florida through the pet trade. They're still traded in parts of the United States, so you can still go to a herp show and buy a Burmese python, which is probably not a good thing. You can also buy an anaconda at some of these herp shows. It's just not very well regulated relative to the harms that some of these species could do to our industries and to our native ecosystems. But basically what happened is lots of people, they get pets, and when they get too big or they just don't want them anymore, they think, oh, I'll just let them go outside. I'll take them to the park and let them go. I've heard people say this about their fish, about all kinds of things. That is not a good idea. And we'll talk about that some more in a minute. But they think that's what happened with the Burmese pythons. It's also possible that someone had them as a pet and a hurricane came through and their house was damaged and they got out in sort of a disaster event like that. So that's another possibility. They think there's probably more than one that got released. But it was first reported in Florida in 1979. And because Miami is so close to the Everglades National Park, they've made it into the Everglades and they've expanded beyond that at this point. They're known to prey on 25 native bird species, alligators, and pretty much every mammal that we have that's big enough that it would want to eat it. They are large snakes, so really small things might be protected somewhat just because there's not that many calories in a very small mammal. But the juveniles might prefer some of these smaller mammals. This shows some of the data. There's a really good paper that was published in 2012 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. This shows the number of pythons removed through time that scientists and wildlife managers and even some local people have removed. And so you can see that very, very few were removed in the 90s and very early 2000s. And we see that as we've gone along, more and more of these have been captured. And we think that this is probably suggestion. We are putting more effort into it, but we think the population has been getting larger and larger as well. So they wanted to look at how these pythons were affecting native mammal species in the Everglades. And so there was some historic data where scientists had driven roads through the Everglades, particularly this road right here. And they kept track of all the roadkill they found on the road. So just mammals that were killed by cars. And they wanted to redo those surveys now that the Burmese pythons had been established to see if the mammal community had changed. And so this shows that data. So the top graph, the pictures show different mammals. So we've got deer up here all the way down to small mammals. We have rabbits and possums and raccoons and foxes, bobcats. And we can see that the green bars are from 1996 to 1997, before they think there were large populations of Burmese pythons. They were there, but they were in smaller numbers. And we can see that the roadkill data shows what you would probably expect. A lot of possums, a lot of raccoons, a few foxes, and a decent number of deer were being hit by cars on this road. And then the red shows 2003 to 2011, and they've scaled this by survey effort. And so you can see that the only thing they found were some rodents. They found, I don't know, 1 or 2 raccoons, very few. And then they found a couple of deer. And that was it. You can see they found no bobcats, no foxes, no coyotes, no rabbits, no possums. And then they did another study where they looked at different areas. So this was on the whole survey route up here. But down here they broke it into areas. And so they had the core, which is the Everglades National Park. They had some peripheral sites that were around the outside, and they had some extraliminal, so some sites they thought were beyond where the Burmese pythons were. And you can see here that there's almost no red on this graph. That means there were almost no mammals in the core of the Everglades National Park. In the peripheral area, they were still finding possums and raccoons. And a couple of rabbits, and a couple of coyotes. And in the areas where they didn't think any Burmese pythons were, this kind of yellowy color, there were lots of possums and raccoons, and some of the other species as well. So they wanted to make sure that there wasn't something else that had changed over this time period, like maybe there's more human development, more houses, which certainly there is. So they wanted to be able to compare areas where they knew Burmese pythons were in the present to areas where they knew they weren't. And you can see there's a huge difference. So there's almost no mammals left in Everglades National Park because of these Burmese pythons. So we'll continue on with problems with invasive species. So we said predation can cause extinctions, especially on islands. There are other problems with invasive species that don't cause extinctions, but still could cause declines or problems for some native species. So one is competition. We talked about predation, hybridization. So if there are closely related species introduced, we can get hybridization, which can make it harder for the native species to be successful reproductively. And so we see examples of this, particularly in ducks. They can alter the habitat, so when vegetation is introduced, that can change what the habitat is like. Another example I wanted to talk about are free-ranging cats. And so this is both feral cats and domestic cats. So cats that people own and feed, but they're outdoor cats. And they found that cats are the highest contributor to bird deaths in the United States and Canada. This data is from Canada, but this is also true for the United States. And so what they did was they compared all causes of deaths in birds in Canada, and they found that feral cats, so cats that nobody owned, caused the most deaths, but the second most was domestic cats that were owned by somebody. And we all know anecdotally, and maybe you have a cat that has done this, they like to go kill things and bring them home as presents. And they don't even necessarily eat them. There were other things that you might think were would be more contribution to deaths of birds, like vehicles or hunting, but those were really small in comparison with cats. And so this shows the estimated frequency of deaths of birds, and then they also looked at small mammals as well, which is estimated to be much, much larger than the effects on birds. And so they really recommend that if you have a cat, that you keep it indoors. And a lot of veterinarians have also suggested that this is much healthier for the cats. They're less likely to get parasites or other diseases that can be very detrimental and make your cats sick. So in general, to reduce effects of non-native species, you should keep your cat inside. One of the effects I mentioned was hybridization. This is an example of that. So this is the California tiger salamander. It is declining. It is a threatened species, and it exists in habitats where barred salamanders have been introduced. Barred salamanders are native to the United States, but they're native to a different part of the United States than the California tiger salamanders. These guys live in California, as you would expect. Barred tiger salamanders live in like Arizona, places like that. These barred tiger salamanders are often used as bait for fishing to catch large fish. And a lot of times there's this bait bucket effect where people will buy bait and then they'll just dump it when they're done fishing wherever they happen to be. And that might not be where the species was collected from. And so that is one way that we can move species around and have invasive species. But these two species hybridize, and that is definitely detrimental to the California tiger salamander. And this is an example of a study that looked at this by a couple of people that are, Jared Johnson is a friend of mine, and I know Ben Fitzpatrick. Basically, they found that the native salamanders did worse. They were not as good at competing when the hybrid salamanders were present. The hybrid salamanders would outcompete the California tiger salamanders. And you can see they look a lot bigger than the California tiger salamanders. And so this made it much harder for the California tiger salamanders to persist and do well in habitats where these species had been introduced. So another problem with invasive species, an example is earthworms. So down where we live, we think of earthworms as a normal part of our ecosystem, but where there's been glaciation in the past, there aren't native earthworms. So the last glacial maximum, about 20,000 years ago, glaciers came all the way down to this line in the United States. So in New England, Michigan, Minnesota, North Dakota, these places historically were covered with ice, and that eliminated any earthworms that lived there. As we have global warming, earthworms are increasing. They've also been just introduced because people have moved them around for bait and for composting and things like that. And so there are earthworms, there are ecosystems that don't really deal with earthworms very well, which sounds funny to us, I know. And so this is what a northeastern forest looks like before earthworms and after earthworms over here. And you can see a lot of the vegetation has disappeared. They really eat up that leaf litter layer that is really important for a lot of different species, like insects and amphibians and reptiles that hide or hibernate in this leaf litter layer. And it can also change the soil structure. So the way they move through the soil changes how water infiltrates and changes nutrient cycling as well. I also mentioned changing habitat. So European buckthorn is an example of this. And it just takes over the whole understory. It's not really a tree, but it's a really large shrub. So you can see this person standing here. It has these berries, which means that it's very easily dispersed by birds. But it was introduced as an ornamental plant, and it has kind of taken over. And it'll outcompete a lot of native species like oaks and maples, and also changes soil properties. So invasive species are not very good for the economy. They are estimated to cost the United States about $120 billion a year. So what do you think those costs are from? Some of them might not be things you would think of. So this money goes to removal efforts, which is probably the obvious answer. It goes to altered soil and water chemistry, so we might need to add fertilizers if we're trying to grow things. We might need to treat water differently. Industrial problems, particularly agriculture, is affected by invasive species. We get alteration, destruction of habitat, loss of recreation value, and even introduced diseases. Some things that happen, like invasive vines, and also invasive insects and birds, can damage electrical equipment. And so you can get lots of different kinds of problems that cost money from these invasive species. And we can see through time that the number of invasive species has been increasing. This shows plants and insects, and this shows mollusks and fish.